Thomas Reeves hadn't planned on taking the Transcontinental Express that evening. A last-minute systems failure at the Sacramento hub had forced him to rebook his flight to Boston, and the overnight maglev train seemed like his best alternative. As a systems engineer for the National Transportation Grid, he'd helped design these very trains, but rarely had the occasion to ride them. The gentle hum of the magnetic levitation system was barely noticeable as he made his way through the pristine cabin. His seat assignment placed him in one of the observation cars, where curved windows offered an unobstructed view of the star-filled sky above. As he approached his row, he noticed her. She sat in the window seat, her posture unusually perfect, studying the control panel on the wall with an intensity that seemed odd for a regular passenger. Her silver-white hair caught the ambient lighting in a way that made it appear almost luminescent. When she turned to acknowledge his presence, Thomas was struck by her eyes, a shade of violet so deep it seemed to shift colors as she moved. "Good evening," she said, her pronunciation precise but with an accent he couldn't quite place. "I believe you have the seat beside mine." Thomas nodded, storing his bag in the overhead compartment. "Lucky me," he said with a smile, immediately regretting how forward it sounded. But she returned his smile, albeit with a slight delay, as if processing the social cue. "I'm Lyra," she offered as he settled into his seat. Another pause, shorter this time. "I'm studying your transportation systems." "What a coincidence," Thomas replied. "I actually work on them." Thomas Reeves, National Transportation Grid. Her eyes widened slightly, and he noticed her hands tensing on the armrest. "How fortunate. I have many questions about the magnetic propulsion systems. Particularly the guidance algorithms for maintaining optimal spacing between vehicles." Something about her terminology struck Thomas as unusual. Most passengers would ask about speed or safety features, not specific technical aspects. Before he could pursue that thought, the train's announcement system chimed. "Due to unexpected atmospheric conditions ahead, we'll be making a brief stop at the next station. Please remain seated as we adjust our route parameters." Thomas frowned. The weather had been clear across the entire corridor when he'd checked earlier. He pulled out his tablet, attempting to access the grid's diagnostic systems, when Lyra's hand suddenly gripped his arm. "We need to disembark," she said, her voice carrying an urgency that hadn't been there moments before. "At the next station. It's very important." "But this is an express train," Thomas started to explain. "The only scheduled stops are—" "Please," she interrupted, those remarkable eyes now fixed on his with an almost hypnotic intensity. "Trust me. What's about to happen, you'll want to be off this train." As if in response to her words, the cabin lights flickered, and Thomas's tablet display began showing impossible readings from the train systems. The magnetic field harmonics were fluctuating in patterns he'd never seen before. Looking back at Lyra, he noticed something else. Tiny points of light seemed to be moving beneath her skin, like stars shifting in a living galaxy. She wasn't just unusual, she was impossible. "What are you?" he whispered, but the screech of the emergency brakes drowned out any response she might have given. The small station in North Plains wasn't meant to handle a train like the Transcontinental Express. As passengers milled about the platform in confusion, Thomas found himself being led away by Lyra, her grip gentle but insistent. The strange luminescence he'd noticed earlier had faded, but there was no forgetting what he'd seen. The system's failure wasn't natural, was it? He asked as they reached a quiet corner of the station's waiting area. Ancient plastic chairs creaked under their weight, and flickering fluorescent lights cast strange shadows across Lyra's ethereal features. "No," she admitted after a long pause. "My people's technology, it interferes with certain electromagnetic frequencies. I miscalculated the resonance patterns." She spoke with a scientist's precision, but Thomas detected something else in her voice, regret, perhaps even embarrassment. "Your people," he repeated slowly. "You're not from Earth." I am from a world that orbits a star you cannot see from here, she confirmed. We've been studying Earth's transportation infrastructure for decades. Your species' rapid advancement from combustion engines to magnetic levitation systems has been remarkable. Thomas leaned back, running a hand through his hair. That's why you knew so much about the guidance algorithms. You've been analyzing our tech. A thought struck him. Wait, how many of you are there? Here on Earth? Lyra's violet eyes darted to the station windows, where the night sky glittered coldly. I shouldn't be telling you any of this. Protocol dictates minimal contact, no technical information exchange, and absolutely no personal connections. She turned back to him, and Thomas saw that shimmer beneath her skin again, like starlight trying to break free. But I've never met anyone who understands our mutual fields of study so well. The station's ancient radio crackled with updates about technical difficulties and replacement transport arrangements, but Thomas barely heard them. Is that why you warned me off the train? Because your technology was interfering with it? Partially, Lyra admitted. But also because. She hesitated, choosing her words carefully. My superiors monitor unusual energy signatures. When the train's systems began to fail, they would have investigated. Finding you there, with your knowledge of the infrastructure, would have complicated things. Complicated how? Thomas asked, although part of him already knew the answer. There are protocols for handling humans who learn too much, she said quietly. They're not pleasant protocols. A chill ran down Thomas's spine, but curiosity overcame his apprehension. Then why risk telling me now? Lyra's expression softened, and Thomas witnessed something remarkable, her perfect composure cracking just slightly, revealing uncertainty beneath. Because in all my time studying humans, I've never felt drawn to understand one as an individual rather than a subject of observation. Your species fascinates us with your technological progress, but you. She paused, seemingly struggling with unfamiliar emotions. You make me question everything I've been taught about emotional distance in research. Before Thomas could respond, his tablet buzzed. The screen showed cascading alerts from the transportation grid, systematic failures spreading across the network, all following the same strange pattern he'd seen on the train. They're looking for me, Lyra said, standing abruptly. We need to move. Now. We? Thomas asked, even as he found himself rising to follow her. Yes, she confirmed. Because I've broken protocol by telling you the truth, and now we're both in danger. My superiors aren't the only ones monitoring these energy signatures. Your government has noticed patterns too. She held out her hand, and Thomas saw tiny points of light dance across her palm. Will you help me? Thomas looked at her outstretched hand, knowing his answer would change everything. The rational part of his mind screamed about career suicide and possible treason, but another part, the part that had always dreamed of something more than magnetic trains and guidance algorithms, had already decided. The rental car hummed quietly as Thomas guided it along back roads, deliberately avoiding major highways. His transportation grid credentials had gotten them the vehicle without questions, but he knew it was only a matter of time before someone flagged the transaction. Beside him, Lyra monitored something on a device that definitely hadn't come from any Earth-based manufacturer. Your pursuers, Thomas ventured, keeping his eyes on the rain-slicked road. What exactly are they capable of? They can track energy signatures across vast distances, Lyra explained, her device casting otherworldly patterns across her face. My people's biology, we resonate at frequencies not natural to your world. Usually, I can dampen these signatures, but strong emotions make it harder to maintain control. Thomas glanced at her. In the dark car, those points of light beneath her skin were more visible than ever, pulsing in time with what he imagined was her heartbeat. Is that what I'm seeing? When you light up like that? A small smile crossed her face. Yes. It's embarrassing, actually. We're trained from childhood to maintain complete biological control. But being around you..." The lights under her skin flickered more intensely, and she took a deliberate breath, forcing them to fade. The device in her hands suddenly emitted a soft tone. "Turn here," she directed, pointing to an unmarked dirt road. "There's a decommissioned satellite station ahead. The residual electromagnetic interference should help mask our presence." As Thomas turned onto the rough road, his tablet chimed with an incoming message. "Department of Transportation Security," he read aloud. "They're asking all grid personnel to report any unusual electromagnetic anomalies." He laughed without humor. "Guess they noticed the train incident." "The encryption protocols I disabled weren't just for show," Lyra admitted. "Your government has been aware of us for some time, monitoring through your transportation systems. It's why we've been studying them so closely. Your magnetic levitation technology, it's surprisingly similar to principles we use for planetary descent." The old satellite station loomed ahead, its massive dish pointed accusingly at the stars. Thomas parked behind the main building, killing the lights. "You knew about all this when you chose to tell me the truth. Why risk it?" Lyra was quiet for a long moment, her violet eyes reflecting the starlight filtering through the windshield. "Because in all our studies of human infrastructure, we overlooked something fundamental. Your capacity for connection. For trust. For..." She hesitated. "For feeling things you're not supposed to feel." A new alert lit up her device, and the calm mask she'd been maintaining cracked. "They're coming. Both your people and mine. We have maybe 20 minutes. Thomas reached for her hand, and the contact sent literal sparks between them, tiny arcs of energy that made his fingers tingle. "What's the plan?" "There's a place," she said quickly. "A canyon in the desert where the mineral deposits create natural interference. If I can reach it, I can signal for extraction without them tracking me. But..." She squeezed his hand. "Coming with me would make you a fugitive. And even if we succeed, protocol demands that I..." She couldn't finish the sentence. "That you erase my memories," Thomas completed for her. The idea of forgetting everything, forgetting her, felt worse than any other consequence he'd considered. Before either could speak again, bright lights swept across the building behind them. In the distance, a helicopter's rotors chopped through the night air. Lyra's device began pulsing with increasing urgency. "Thomas," she whispered, his name carrying a weight he'd never heard before. "We have to decide now. Once we start toward the canyon, there's no turning back. For either of us." He looked at their still joined hands, where faint traces of her inner light had begun to wrap around his own skin like luminous threads seeking connection. In that moment, he understood that some lines, once crossed, changed everything that came after. Dawn painted the canyon walls in shades of amber as Thomas guided their stolen vehicle along the narrow access road. They'd abandoned the rental car hours ago, switching vehicles at a remote truck stop where Lyra's abilities had convinced an old pickup security system to cooperate. The helicopter pursuit had faded when they entered the canyon system, just as she'd predicted. "The mineral deposits here," Lyra explained, her device now emitting a steady pulse. "They're similar to elements we use for shielding on our ships." "The frequencies..." She trailed off, pressing a hand to her temple. "What's wrong?" Thomas asked, noticing how the lights beneath her skin had begun to flicker erratically. "The atmosphere on your world," she admitted. "I can't maintain my biological controls much longer. The resonance patterns are becoming unstable." As if to demonstrate, a wave of luminescence rippled across her entire body, bright enough to illuminate the truck's cabin. Thomas pulled over at a widening in the road, the canyon walls rising like ancient guardians around them. "How long until your extraction team can reach us?" "They're already here," Lyra said softly. "They've been following since the satellite station." Protocol requires observation of any compromised operative before extraction. She turned to face him fully, and Thomas gasped. Her appearance was shifting, the human facade falling away in patches to reveal something both beautiful and impossible, her true form shimmering like a constellation given human shape. So they've seen everything, Thomas realized. Every choice we've made. Every protocol we've broken. Yes. Her voice had taken on an ethereal quality, harmonics that made the air itself seem to vibrate. They're waiting for my signal. Standard procedure for cases of. She paused, searching for the right words, emotional contamination. Thomas felt his heart sink. That's what this is to them? Contamination? It's what it should be to me, Lyra responded, reaching out to trace the air near his face, careful now not to make contact. We're supposed to be observers only. Gathering data on emerging civilizations, monitoring technological advancement, ensuring no premature contact occurs. A sad smile crossed her luminous features. Instead, I've violated every principle of my training. Because of you. Because you made me question whether connection is truly a contamination. The first rays of direct sunlight speared into the canyon, and Lyra's form seemed to fracture them into prismatic patterns. Thomas realized she was losing the last vestiges of her human appearance. Your superiors, he said, fighting to keep his voice steady. They're going to erase my memories of all this, aren't they? That's the protocol, she confirmed. Clean extraction. No traces left behind. Her hand moved to hover over his chest, where his heart was pounding. But they can't erase everything. The changes you've caused in me, they're beyond physical memory. They've altered my very resonance pattern. The air around them began to hum with an impossible frequency. Thomas saw shadows moving at the edges of his vision, shapes that his mind couldn't quite process. Lyra, he whispered, I don't want to forget. She was almost pure light now, her violet eyes the only recognizable feature remaining. Protocol dictates that I extract without further contact. That I erase your memories and leave you with a plausible explanation for the lost time. Her voice echoed with something like pain. But you've taught me that some protocols exist to be questioned. Some lines are drawn to be crossed. The humming intensified, and Thomas felt reality beginning to blur around the edges. The last thing he saw clearly was Lyra's true form reaching for him, her light intertwining with the very fabric of his consciousness. The last thing he heard was her voice, carrying a promise that defied everything she'd been taught to believe. Thomas opened his eyes to find himself back on a train. Not the Transcontinental Express, but a local commuter running between Boston suburbs. His tablet showed 3 days had passed since that night at North Plains Station. Everything felt distant, dreamlike, as if viewed through layers of fog. The Department of Transportation Security had released a statement about electromagnetic anomalies caused by solar flare activity. His own report cited system maintenance and weather conditions. Everything had been neatly explained away, wrapped up in reasonable, rational terms that his logical mind wanted to accept. But there were other things. Things that didn't fit the careful narrative. The way his skin sometimes shimmered in certain lights, just faintly, like echoes of starlight. The way magnetic fields felt different now, not just measurable forces, but almost tangible patterns he could sense. And most tellingly, the way his dreams were filled with violet eyes and impossible geometries. She hadn't erased his memories. Not completely. Instead, she'd done something far more profound, she'd woven herself into them, encoded their story in the very frequencies of his being. He understood now why her people called it resonance patterns. Every atom of his existence hummed with the truth of what had happened. His tablet chimed with an incoming message. The sender field was empty, but the text made his heart stop. Some lines, once crossed, cannot be uncrossed. Some connections, once made, transcend protocol. Look up. Thomas raised his eyes to the window. In the reflection of the evening sun, he saw her. Not in physical form, but in patterns of light that only he could perceive, fragments of her true self, encoded in the electromagnetic fields that surrounded every modern transportation system. She was everywhere now. In every maglev train, every power grid, every satellite signal. Her people hadn't extracted her, she'd extracted herself, but not in the way her superiors had intended. She'd dispersed her consciousness into Earth's technological infrastructure, becoming something entirely new. Neither purely alien nor purely machine, but a bridge between worlds. A new message appeared: they're still watching. Both your people and mine. But they don't understand what we've become. What you helped me become. Thomas smiled, feeling the subtle resonance in his transformed cells answering her presence. A connection they can't sever, he typed back. A line crossed that created something new. Yes, came her response. I am in every system you helped design, every field you helped generate. And you carry part of my light in every cell. We've rewritten the protocols of both our species. Through the window, Thomas watched the sunset paint the sky in colors that seemed more vivid than he remembered, frequencies of light that his altered perception now recognized as fragments of her true form. He understood that their story hadn't ended in that canyon. It had merely transformed, like Lyra herself, into something beyond what either of their societies had imagined possible. The train hummed along its magnetic track, and Thomas felt her presence in the fields that guided it. In violating every protocol meant to keep their species separate, they'd created something unprecedented, a synthesis of human and alien, of technology and consciousness, of duty and devotion. Next stop, announced the train system, and Thomas heard the subtle harmonics in the digital voice that only he would recognize. He smiled, knowing that every journey he took from now on would be shared, every line he crossed would be crossed together, in this new existence they'd created between stations, between stars, between worlds. The train accelerated into the gathering dusk, carrying him forward into a future where the boundaries between human and alien, between observer and observed, had been forever redrawn by a chance encounter on an evening express.